I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'll introduce my case. I'll probably get emotional throughout that, and then I will try to wrap things up a little bit inspirational. So that's the goal. Who am I? I'm Racheal Nicholas. I've worked as a social worker and team leader at Ktunaxa Kinbasket Child and Family Services in Cranbrook. I've been doing signs of safety or using signs of safety for about 8.5 years as well. I also have a bachelor's in criminology. I have a master's in psychology. And I quit my job 2 weeks ago, so these pictures that I have are of my old office, not my new one. I now work as a manager at a homeless outreach and advocacy center for the Ktunaxa Nation as well. Cranbrook is located in the Rocky Mountains. It's in the heart of the Rockies. That was my old office view, and my new one, if people are on my Facebook, is a little tiny office with a bunch of bars. So that was my old office. This is an old church. It's on the reserve, and this was an old residential church that's there. And this was the old residential school that's been converted into a golf course, casino, and resort, and it's lovely if you ever get a chance to visit. So, like Heidi said, this is a very personal story because it's my own when I was on the receiving end of services and not one as I was a social worker for. So the who involves me, my husband, my parents, just 1 second. My best friend. And the workers were Amanda and Bart, and Amanda was actually a social worker on my team prior to this happening, and Bart was the executive director of the agency and my supervisor as a team leader, but they were also the workers in my case. There was a psychiatrist, a provincial postpartum psychiatric specialist, and a provincial consultant from the Ministry of Children and Family in BC. And before I jump into what happened, I want to recognize my privilege in this. And first, it was that people knew me as a professional first and foremost when I entered into the system. And I think a lot of times we meet families at their lowest points and not at their potential. I think second, I had a healthy support network that surrounded me. I knew a number of professionals, my family was very healthy, and I had the supports I needed to get to where I needed to go. And third, I think I could have called upon the best of the best, including people in this room, had I not been able to get my son back into my care. So the what? Oh, and of course my son. This all revolves around him. So the case, in October 2013, I was a team leader, but I was covering as an executive director because all my management team was at a training with Andrew and Heidi in Calgary on signs of safety. My husband was in information technology, and this was our first child, named Jake. The pregnancy was planned. It was well monitored throughout. I attended all my midwife appointments, took all my prenatal vitamins, uploaded all my belly pictures onto Facebook, did the things that you're supposed to do. And outside of morning sickness, it was pretty good until the last trimester. My liver started to fail, and they told me it was life-threatening for both me and my son. So they induced me early at 35 weeks. And I was in the hospital for 11 days, as was my son, because we both had complications, major health complications. So the intake, my husband actually reported it. I had given birth. I was released on the 17th after health complications. On the 21st, he brought me in because I had stripped my son and myself naked in the living room and told him that we had to go into the light. They were hoping that a couple nights sleep would help me get some rest and get me back to normal, but it didn't. I kept trying to leave the hospital as well, so they certified me, which in Canada means that you're involuntarily admitted into the psych ward and you can't leave, and RCMP will transport you back. And they locked down the whole unit. Sleep didn't help. The following morning, I was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. Now, prior to having it, I had no idea what it was. So what it is, it's a mental illness. And it happens about 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 births, which seems rare, but it's about as common as Down syndrome, just not as talked about. You experience delusion, violence, hallucinations. You can be irritable, hyperactivity, inability to sleep, paranoia, rapid mood swings, difficulty communicating, and you're at an increased risk of suicide and an increased risk of infanticide. And they don't know the cause other than hormones, lack of sleep, all of those things. So my symptoms. At first I was elated and full of energy. When I got home, I felt on top of the world. Even though we had had the high-stress situation of giving birth, I felt better than I had ever felt before. Then it started going weird. I started seeing negative spirits, and I started smudging the house. And this totally isn't out of the norm for me, because I do that kind of thing. I'm married to an Aboriginal man, so smudging and talking to dead people is still within the normal range. Where it switched is that I started to get religious and quote the Bible, and I'm not a very religious person. And then, of course, when I stripped myself and my son down, said we were going into the light, that's where my husband got triggered, took me up to the hospital. And when I was there getting admitted, I sang This Little Light of Mine on repeat, thinking that demons were trying to get my soul. And after being admitted, there's a period where I blacked out from about the 22nd to the 27th. I know during that time I was given antipsychotics. And I did what any social worker would do afterwards, and I requested my medical files to see what happened. The first point that I have is, write as though a client will read the files, because they might. And I know it took me a few bottles of wine to get through these files. But I also think, too, is understanding your authority when you're writing your case notes. One of the psychiatric specialists put a note in there that I should not care for my son because I was a danger to him. And she didn't put anything else or elaborate on that at all. And I think as a social worker, I probably would have highlighted that, put it in the court documents, and it would have followed me through my entire case, if not my entire life. And knowing your authority in that is very, very important. According to my medical records, anytime I didn't sleep, my health got worse. I would spit out medication, quoting it was evil. I would start throwing away sacred items, journals, clothing, pictures. I was talking to myself. I was taking off my clothes inappropriately in front of people. My mood would change rapidly, and my mental status would as well. And they scaled the psychiatrist and the psychiatric specialist, the specialist who had 25 years experience in the psych ward, and said 0 to 10. 10 is this is the worst case of psychosis, and 0, it's just a mild case. They scaled me at a 7 and said that they weren't sure how long it would take to recover, but upwards of a year. So that's what happened in a nutshell. I'm going to jump into the learnings now for the sake of time. And the first is to be patient and help me understand. I know coming out, I would constantly ask the nurses why I was in the hospital, what had happened, and they would give me that look like I'd asked them that 1,000 times before. And I know as a social worker, I often get frustrated with families when I say, I've told you this, I've told you this, I've told you this. But I now understand when your stress levels are so high, the rate that you can absorb information is decreased drastically. And I think it's brilliant with signs of safety that you write things down, because not only does it help you get clear, but it helps families be able to reflect back on it and absorb it at the rate that they can. And we're working with people with mental health issues, addictions issues, and a whole plethora of stress. So be patient. The second learning. Yeah, some workers are just assholes. And I believe for the most part that workers are trying their best, but there are some people in this field who are burnt out, who shouldn't be in this field, who are just hanging in there to get their last paycheck. And I want you to close your eyes for a minute and think that if you were on the other side of services, who on your team would you be most confident in working through your case? And with eyes still closed, think, who would I dread having worked through my case? And you can open them. And I think if there's somebody that you dread on your team and you're in a manager or team leader position, you really need to work through that. Because in this field, we're working with the most broken and raw and vulnerable people who need the most support. And if you have shitty workers, they have the potential to shift a person or shatter them. And we cannot have any more workers who shatter people. And the other learning is that things aren't always as they seem or as they appear. And the story that I want to talk about is around a breast pump. So, when I started to come out of my blackout craziness, I remember there was a breast pump in my hospital room. And early on in the stages, I was still able to breastfeed and provide milk for my son. And at this time, I was having about 30 minutes to an hour supervised visits 2 to 3 times a week. And that's not a whole lot, because in the hospital, time moves much, much slower than it does in the real world. So when I didn't have him, I would often sit in my room and I would pump. And I remember sitting there one day, and a nurse came in. Case in point, kind of an asshole nurse who should have taken the day off. And she looked at me and she said, "Why in the world are you breastfeeding? You'll never be able to breastfeed your son, so stop trying." And this was devastating. I had read all the books prior about how nourishing breast milk could be. And to me, it was much more than a pump, because I couldn't hold my son. I couldn't be with my son. And this was the only thing left that I could do for him. And now I couldn't even do that. And that night, I remember they don't give you things to kill yourself with in the psych ward for good reason. But I went to the kitchen and I saved a cup. And I brought it into the bathroom and I filled up the tub and I used it to plug the drain because they don't give you plugs for the drain either. And I remember holding my breath and sinking under the water. And doing that until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. And I did that a number of times until the nurses came in and knocked and told me to get out. And I went to my room crying. And for the first time I prayed to God, but not in the way that you would think I would. I asked him to kill me. You know, I said, I don't care if it's an overdose, a mix-up of medications. I don't care if another patient goes violent. Just please, whatever you do not wake me up. And that, to me, shows the power that hopelessness can have on a person. Because that was hopelessness. And the next morning, the nurse came in, and it was the same nurse. And I had had this cork board, because I woke up. God didn't kill me. I had this cork board of my son, and I was ripping up photographs of my son because it was too hard to see him. And she came in and she said, "Why are you doing that? Why are you ripping up photos of your son?" And this is where I want to pause the story and introduce a bit of a concept. So I know Yoka and Mana in their presentation had talked about the gorilla being this kind of angry, defensive, back against the wall cage beast that jumps out sometimes, and you always want to try to cage him if you're in a meeting. What I want to add to that is the concept of a little monkey, which is that raw, broken, hurt, vulnerable part of you. And I think the best thing about the gorilla is that sometimes it comes out to protect that raw, broken part of you. And that's the benefit of the gorilla. So after the nurse asked me why I was ripping up those photos, I think I was so raw that the only thing that could come out was my gorilla. And I looked at her and I said, "I do not have a son. These are not my pictures. Now get out of my room." And she canceled my visits. But I think with families too, we often meet their gorilla because you're hitting them at such a raw, broken, vulnerable time that the only way they can deal with you is to have that aggressive gorilla in front of them. And that comes out missed visits, angry meetings, telling you to F off, all of those pieces. But what you need to remember is that behind that gorilla, there's still that little monkey sitting there. And if you can tap into that place, you can connect and make shifts. So now that was hopelessness. We'll move into hope. I had another nurse come on shift, and she was lovely. And she sat with me in this kind of way that I felt like my gorilla could step back. And she saw this little guy sitting in my room, and she asked me about him. And this is the one thing that I didn't throw away that reminded me of my son, because he looked like a little monkey when he was born. And she asked me why I kept him. And what she did is started asking miracle questions. And I don't think she knew at the time. And they weren't brilliant, but it would be, what would be different if your son were here now? What would you be doing with him? And what would your day look like if he were here? And as she asked those, I started visualizing, I would hold him, I would cuddle him, I would change him, I would bathe him. I just wanted to sing with him. And for the first time in my life, it gave me hope that I might actually get there. And I think that's the brilliance of the miracle question, is it shifts your perspective in a time of despair and gives you a little bit of hope to move forward or to visualize what your future could look like. And she said, why don't you just do that with him? Just bring him around the hospital, hold him, hug him, sing to him, and I promise you one day he'll be back in your arms. And that was the first time in the case that I felt hope. The thing with hope, though, is you have to keep it alive. And I was so excited the next morning. I went to the doctor and I was like, I really am ready to get out. I've worked through this. And I said, what do I have to do? And he said, well, we're just going to reassess your mental health, and once it's stable, we'll let you out. But he wouldn't really get clear on what that meant. So the next day I go to his office, okay, so I'm ready to leave. What do I need to do? And he's like, oh, well, once you get stable and once your mental health is under control, we'll let you out. And this is the idea of not having clear goalposts. Not only does it not make the workers clear, but it brings a level of hopelessness back into the case for families. And for me, I felt devastated, but at this point, my rebel was starting to come back. So I escaped the hospital on October 29th. It was 20 days after giving birth. I scaled a 10-foot wooden fence and left. And then that was it. No, I'm just kidding. I went for a walk in the woods. I ended up going back to my parents' house, and then they took me back to the hospital. And I was upset. But in the end, it worked out, because it forced the psychiatrist to call the social workers, who then got them clear on the trajectory. And we worked up to 1 hour passes, afternoon passes and overnight passes, and I was finally released November 8th, which was actually my due date for my son. This is sort of where the real work started. The danger statement once I got home and returned home was that the social workers and agencies were worried that Racheal will not return to the Racheal we all know, would not be able to care for Jake, or would unintentionally, and that's in red in brackets because they let me add it in afterwards, hurt or kill Jake in the way she talked about by taking him into the light. And the original one said murder him, but they let me change murder to kill, so. It involved a solid safety plan. I had to have 24/7 supervision in the beginning. They compiled a list of red flags from the counselors, the doctors, from myself, my friends, my family, and it was shared with our entire network. And they developed a clear trajectory on how I was able to work my way from 30 minutes unsupervised all the way up to caring for my son, which took about 6.5 months. This video is the workers, Bart and Amanda, talking about the case, and once it's done, I'll follow up in my conclusion.
And that was the hardest one to formulate, wasn't it? For me it was, yeah. That danger statement. Because I knew that it was going to shatter her.
And that was around the fact that she
could potentially kill him.
I wanted to change it a bit.
Yeah.
But you guys said that I couldn't take out the kill.
The kill part, yeah.
But I could change it to accidentally or unintentionally.
Unintentionally, yeah.
For me, it was interesting because I was super hopeful and quite confident in the family's ability to ensure safety.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, for Racheal, I wasn't sure.
Mm-hmm.
I struggled. How to create hope, how to be hopeful. She, by checking in where we were at and exploring our own vulnerability, I think was super helpful for her. But the other thing is, she said, imagine the day that this is all worked through, and Racheal has worked through this in a good way and is able to parent. So, she was, even though she didn't have the language best hope, she was talking about best hopes.
Yeah.
And she said, just think how powerful of an experience and how powerful this learning will be for Racheal, for you guys, and so I think she gave to me anyway some things to glom onto around. Wow, yeah, if we can make this work, combined with knowing the family was there to support and would ensure safety, but not knowing if
the important thing was that we needed to focus on a good safety plan and bringing her family together. And as Bart talked about all the complicating factors, I actually found the work very simple.
Yeah, nice.
It was, and it was simple because of her family.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah, I mean, I was a facilitator of bringing everybody together in a highly emotional situation,
right.
Of course, but I always knew it was going to be okay. I knew she was going to do everything in her power to be healthy and to get through it. So I think that's where the hope lied for me was knowing that she was going to dig deep. And I don't know. I think I remember just telling her that like it's going to be okay. Like we're going to get through this. And just that went through my mind all the time. Just it's going to be okay. Yeah, I just knew.
Nice.
Well, yeah, you have to.
The social worker on that, her grandmother had passed away, and her cousin, or her nephew, had gone missing literally like the day before she came in to film this, and I told her not to worry about it, but she said that she had to do it for me, so I'm very appreciative. I think, too, she states that the most important piece was having a solid safety plan, and I think that was true for Jake. But deeper to me was knowing I had a team that made sure they held firm on their concerns by not allowing me to kill my son, but also believed that I would succeed. It was that balance of rigor and grace, or being firm but hugely, hugely kind. And prior to this, I used to think that I needed to work through the case perfectly, have the perfect danger statement, perfect trajectory, perfect safety goals. And I think those pieces are important and require a high level of skill. But no, now I know that we're working with families as well on the most deepest and impactful ways that we could possibly be working with them. And I think as a worker, it's important to keep in mind that you have the power to shift or shatter a family. And that all depends on whether you foster hope or you foster hopelessness. So my hope from this presentation is that you see the impact that hopelessness can have on a person, and that hope can have on a person. And if you were to ask me what the most pivotal, impactful moment of my case was, it was when that nurse was able to sit with me in that place of vulnerability and take this monkey and transform it into a glimpse of hope into the future, into my son, into something that could comfort me in those times when I was most alone and down and afraid. And it was nothing short of a miracle. But that worker didn't have to move mountains for me. She simply had to give me a glimpse of hope into the future and nourish that. And I think ultimately that's what we have to aim to do in this work. And it didn't take a mountain. All it actually took was this guy, this one little monkey. So thank you.